For the uninitiated, Questions for Men was a Twitter hashtag started by Australian columnist Clementine Ford, which very quickly started trending worldwide in early February 2015. As the official story goes, Ford began to tweet questions with the Questions for Men hashtag in an attempt to highlight the many sexist double standards she has observed between men and women, stating that some were intended as genuine inquiries, while others were designed to highlight what she already knew to be hypocritical approaches to gendered behaviour. The tag very quickly began trending as other women started adding their own questions, taking in experiences such as unequal pay, walking home safely, and abortion rights. Within days, various media outlets in Australia, the US, the United Kingdom, France and Germany began highlighting the trend and generally praising Ford and other contributors for holding a mirror up to the everyday examples of sexism that women have to put up with. In her own article discussing the phenomenon, Ford noted that one of the positive outcomes of the feed was that men also began engaging and expressing their own frustrations about patriarchal conditioning in their answers. She noted that this is one of the enormous strengths of social media. A hashtag alone might not have the power to change the world, but it does have the power to start a conversation. And the instantaneous reach of Twitter has made it possible for women to have these conversations in a way that can no longer be discounted or silenced. This is all certainly one perspective on the content posted to this hashtag, and it was this perspective only that was portrayed in the various write-ups in the mainstream media. But the so-called journalists covering the story also completely ignored a number of other sides to it that were at the very least at least as noteworthy as the relatively vanilla everyday sexism write-ups that eventually got published. Because as anyone with a Twitter account can to this day go and confirm for themselves, relatively quickly the very vast majority of men and women contributing to the thread began to significantly diversify from Ford's original tone. And as a case study, it also serves as an excellent example of the phenomenon that I call the glass blind spot, which is essentially an extension of the metaphor used by feminists to describe the invisible barriers that they can see. And a glass blind spot can be used to describe the extraordinary phenomenon where someone consciously or unconsciously ignores information relevant to a discussion about equality because it would undermine or distract from their preferred narrative. And crucially, while clearly we all have our own personal perspectives and prejudices, a glass blind spot is so big that a fucking elephant could hide in it, and the simple act of pointing at it has a tendency to shatter the illusion that the person pushing the proposed narrative is an honest broker, or indeed that they are remotely motivated by the notion of championing equality of opportunity and fairness for all. One of the most obvious aspects of the bigger picture about a thread made up of rhetorical questions about the challenges and disadvantages peculiar to persons of a particular sex is that anyone taking the time to read it will be confronted with literally hundreds of tweets highlighting examples of sexism and double standards experienced by men. And as it rarely harms to have a sense of humour in this life, inevitably quite a lot of people decided that the best response to a series of patronising rhetorical questions calling men out in their Twitter feed was to add a bit of funny to proceedings, often with refreshingly hilarious results. Indeed, a key factor involved in the hashtag trending so highly was the fact that the discourse very quickly extended into examples of sexism experienced by men, and replies pointing out the double standards at play in what many women as well as men perceived as an attack on men generally. Indeed, given the main type of questions eventually populating the hashtag could have easily have been named questions for men, or even answers for feminists. Predictably, not everyone welcomed the widening narrative and considered some contributions to be an intrusion. One of the very few journalists to even acknowledge this aspect was Clementine Ford herself, but she simply dismissed such contributions as missing the point and generally coming from faceless abusive trolls and MRA derailers. After following the thread for a few days, I began to wonder what proportion of offensive vitriol experienced by tweeters like Clementine would genuinely be considered to be reasonably offensive by a reasonably average person. Now, one faceless rape threat is quite obviously one too many, and out of curiosity I had a look over the responses posted to some of Ford's initial questions, and was sincerely surprised when I struggled to find overtly offensive examples of contributions that I would personally feel comfortable describing as abusive. And I was even more surprised to read about some of the colourful comments that Clementine had herself previously contributed to conversations on social media. If you're familiar with Ms. Ford, then you're probably once again having a good laugh at the expense of my naivety. But for the uninitiated, in her own words, Clementine Ford describes herself as an angry feminist and professional card-carrying misandrist who, when she's not corrupting the minds of young women and encouraging them into the kind of radical separatist lesbianism that frightens the Prime Minister, writes men-hating screeds in the sulphuric depths of Fairfax, Australia's resident witch cavern, The Daily Life. She likes to swear at people she doesn't agree with, spend Valentine's Day writing poetry and paying respect to her elders.
Just going to work around this thing on my chest. Thank you so much. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land and I pay my respects to elders past and present.
Her critics note her propensity to goad, incite and ultimately match hate with hate online, while her fans laud her as some sort of feminist flamethrower fighting fire with fire and scorching misogynistic trolls on social media, where men can be fully exposed for the ugly characters that they really are.
Ugh. I'm so sick of talking about men. Ugh, I have a male baby and it's just all the time, it's feed me, pay me attention to me, engage me. Ugh, so boring. Men, 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 men. It's always about men.
Now, of course, it's entirely relevant to mention that all of this very sloppy coverage of a briefly trending Twitter hashtag was almost entirely restricted to women's or lifestyle sections of the predictably progressive participating publications. And editors may argue that they were simply giving their audience exactly what they want. But aside from the obvious double standards involved, including an incredibly patronising attitude towards the intelligence of the mostly women who read such articles and can presumably cope with a nuance involving at least 50 shades of grey, the increasing problem with echo chambers is that by the time a collective understanding of the story has crept into the larger public consciousness, it has been exaggerated, distorted and then set in stone to reflect the interests of those who have invested the most in the telling of the tale. My own understanding of the limitation of Laura Bates's widely publicised Everyday Sexism project is a good example of this. Until taking the time to personally visit her site, my perception of the project was almost exclusively informed by the trust I placed on the merit of mainstream media reports. And the same can be said for the infamous Gamergate, which aside from some background noise about sexism in computer games, occurred almost entirely outside of my frequency. Now, it may have been some time since I've been a regular in front of the PlayStation, but like most gamers, I do place a lot of stock in the concept of fair play. And consequently, the more I've learnt about that particular shitstorm, the less surprised I am that so many of the characters and social commentators that I now follow originally came out of that particular movement. My own single most significant red pill moment came in late 2012, when in the aftermath of the extraordinary revelations about children's TV legend Jimmy Savile, another presenter from my childhood handed our then Prime Minister David Cameron a list of alleged paedophiles from within his own party. And whatever the truth about that particular matter, it quickly led to a much greater awareness of the wealth of independent media that diligently questions, subverts, circumvents, and increasingly informs so-called mainstream media narratives, and a growing appreciation of collective open source methods for making up my own mind. For a couple of generations at the very least, most children have been actively taught to judge people by the content of their character, and it happens to be my personal belief that the very vast majority of people are motivated by positive intentions, even when the consequence of their actions can be incredibly negative for for others around them. But unfortunately and increasingly, people seem to be judging others based on the limiting and markedly different content of their own preferred media. And the more I've learned that, the more concerned I've become about the impact of echo chambers and the seemingly increasive negative role that identity politics is having within them. And while my blog was always as much about educating myself and making my own mind up about matters, that initial ambition to challenge minds through conversations soon narrowed to a more passive aim of trying to make some sort of positive contribution by simply researching and documenting the facts about issues that interest me as clearly and as fairly as possible, so that people who come across my work can make their own mind up. And that is very much the main motivation and aspiration for this channel, which is all a very roundabout way of getting round to telling you what you can expect to see and hear from it. You'll find videos that consider, document, challenge and comment on some of the more controversial, taboo and often downright bizarre aspects of modern identity politics, particularly gender politics. I offer a relatively underrepresented male perspective on gender equality narratives, and while ultimately I want to build an audience and make content for people who think and feel a little bit like me, my principal motivation is the hope that some of my content might challenge and inform more conventional-minded Joes and Janes who may occasionally happen to stumble upon it. Inevitably, my personality, preferences, personal and political opinions are all very much part of the package. So while you'll mostly find open source fact-based documentaries, this channel is also a bit of a lucky dip, offering a little bit of comedy, culture and campaigning, and even the occasional late night musical meditations. I've resolved that one of the most effective contributions I can make in this brave new world of fake news, social media censorship and so-called culture wars is to try and make well-researched, thoughtful and hopefully insightful documentary style videos on topics that might offer ammunition to those in the trenches who may feel currently outgunned and who are also part of the ever-growing army of peaceful law-abiding liberalists at the sharper end of debates and battles for the mind. To date, my principal focus has been on the intersection between the legacy media's obsession with high-profile incidents of online abuse and the concerns about censorship and controlling free speech. The centerpiece of this content is a 6-part series called Virtual Abuse, which considers the available research on online abuse, the way some politicians and campaigners interpret this data, including the very political Reclaim the Internet campaign. I also examined 2 of the more dubious high-profile examples cited by this group while calling for action and censorious legislation, before in the last 2 episodes ultimately considering what self-interests drive legacy media and so-called social justice warriors to lobby for legislation to protect adults from exposure to harsh language and diverse opinions. I'll continue to track developments in this area, and the other elephant I'll be pointing at for the foreseeable is the issue that gave this channel its title, namely the biggest blind spot in current mainstream gender equality narratives, which is of course the human rights inequalities experienced by men and boys. And my next big project is a documentary series considering the attitudinal and structural barriers that help to keep that blind spot in place. Personally, I think I've led a fairly charmed life. Like everyone, I've faced my challenges, but I'm more concerned about how other men and women are affected by this ignorance. Unlike this increasingly mythical concept of a Western patriarchy, sadly these barriers are all too real and too often downplayed. But the good news is that it's incalculably easier to smash things when they have substance, and I sincerely believe that the more people that point at them, the harder glass blind spots become for everyone else to ignore.